Hello, my name is Skylar Lanier, and today I will be speaking about the Scott Joplin 1911 opera, Treemonisha. Scott Joplin was a prominent ragtime pianist of the late 1800s, early 1900s, who had been dubbed the king of ragtime. He had made various pieces, around, I believe, 40 ragtime pieces, and as well as two operas that were either reflective of the time or a bit of a self insert of his morals and upbringing. Scott Joplin was born in 1868 in Texarkana, Texas, which is a town on the border of the two states, Texas and Arkansas. And he was born to a mother who was a freed woman, a northern woman, and his father who had been a slave in the South. The two of them had Scott, and the rest of their family, I believe they had six children together overall. And Scott's mother had worked as a cleaner for a white family in the area. And while she was at their homes, Scott Joplin was allowed to play piano in their homes. He eventually got lessons from different teachers in the area, and one day a German a German-born piano teacher named Julian Weiss had heard Scott and needed to teach him. And so, out of the kindness of his heart, because he did not charge for Scott's lessons, he even helped the Joplin family buy him a piano. And through these, Scott had been exposed to German music and had been exposed to more European music and operas as a whole. This coming forth and showing itself in his later compositions of the two operas that he had made. While Joplin had shown a big, big proficiency in playing piano, his father was a rail worker and very much felt that Scott would benefit more from being a rail worker himself and making sure that he had money instead of being a musician like his mother had enjoyed. Now, Scott's father did play, I believe he played violin while his mother was a banjo player and a singer, but the father saw the assurance of money as something more important for his son. And eventually, he did leave the family. Scott, in his late teens, left Texarkana, which is a rural town, and ended up going north to play ragtime and became an arranger of music around the World's Fair in Chicago. He went and played at various saloons and different bars and brothels, making sure that even though he wasn't a part of the official World's Fair, the people who were around did hear his music and enjoyed him. He had traveled around the North and had played music all around, gaining a name for himself, and eventually created two operas. First being a Guest of Honor, which was about the meeting of Booker T. Washington and new President Theodore Roosevelt. Uh, yes, Franklin Roosevelt. And the meeting between them, while it wasn't ever recorded as far as what they said, Scott speculated and created an opera about the two. That was in 1905, or sorry, 1903, but unfortunately, that opera was never put on as they had collected money for it, but the promoter actually took all of the money and the opera was never performed. It also seems that the transcripts for the opera was lost, so it seems like that is completely lost to time. But Treemonisha is an opera that he created in 1911 or 1910 and published in 1911, which is about a woman named Treemonisha who was born in Texarkana, Texas, to two parents who found her, actually. They found her under a tree the father being named Ned, the mother being named Manisha. And they raised her as her own, and they had found a way to hide the fact that she was an orphan. And when they had raised her, Manisha, who cleaned for a white woman, much like Scott's mother in real life, she exchanged the services to get Treemonisha an education. And so the white woman who was in the home, she taught Treemonisha how to read. And when we start the opera, she is a very smart, beautiful young woman who is trying to dissuade the people of the town from being influenced and interacting with conjurers, people who engage in the practice of hoodoo, which is a blend of African and American, European, and Native American practices that many a slave and those in the South had taken part in. And this divination was something that Treemonisha was trying to warn against. And after her attempts at refuting the conjurers, she was kidnapped. Later, the conjurers who took her, are trying to punish her for trying to keep them from selling their wares and pushing their hoodoo onto the people of her town. And while they are about to punish her and inflict harm upon her, someone who she had taught how to read in the town comes through, scares the rest of the hoodoo practitioners away, returns her home, and upon her arrival, the people of the town think that she should be the leader of all of them, men and women. And that is, for the most part, the plot of Treemonisha. Treemonisha went through a bit of a struggle as far as the production is concerned. Scott Joplin, again, he had written it in 1910, published it as a piano and vocal score in 1911. So there's the piano and vocal reduction of it. The opera, however, never got to be staged while Joplin was alive. The opera did have a read through, and unfortunately, it was not received that well. There was a review of the time that said that it was thin and unconvincing. There are many criticisms of the opera, one of which being that the libretto itself is not strong. Joplin did not only make the music for it, but he also wrote the opera, which is quite evidenced by the fact that the woman who is who is the subject of the opera, Treemonisha, was born the same year as Scott, and has a mother who worked the same job as Scott, and is born in the same town as Scott. So it is quite obviously a self-insert of Scott's own life and morality, and him trying to tell a story. But the audiences and reviewers did not actually take much interest in it. And also in the 1910s, there's one thing for ragtime artists to be playing what is deemed black music. It is another for them to try and venture into what is classically and still currently seen as a European art form, a white art form. And so was not able to raise money around the time, was not able to get backers, financial or otherwise, when he had made the opera. And so he had died shortly thereafter, never having seen a full staging of the opera that he created. But later, in the 1970s, actually 1972, there was a world premiere of this opera. Dr. T.J. Anderson, who was an African American composer at the time and exalted and very highly praised, he was in residence at Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and someone had actually found the scores for Treemonisha. They were damaged, and there happened to be an actual orchestration of it, but all of the pages were water damaged and illegible. And so Dr. Anderson had done his own orchestration, I believe, of the yes, Dr. Anderson had done his own orchestration and arrangement of this opera, and it was put on in 1972, and it had received praise. It had become maybe not a national sensation, but it had received enough buzz that PBS had done another presentation of this opera a few years later, and these had started to grow the lore of the opera. This opera, when it was created, had been around a lot of black political, not necessarily turmoil, but had been created around a lot of discussion and new thoughts and ideas being waged against one another. And again, in the 70s, it had also been at a somewhat tumultuous time in African American politics and politics as a whole in the United States of America. And these had aided in how the audiences had seen what was going on and also what went into the actual operas themselves. There is a quote that I want to read. Just one second. Okay. Sorry. It looks like that never got taken down. But one of the political influences of Joplin's time was Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington was a black man born a slave in the South, and when he was a child, the Civil War happened, he became emancipated, and his whole life after that was to advocate for his one's own self-worth and what they can do to better themselves. Booker T. Washington was a leader in black conservative thought at the time, believing that the blacks of the day should not advocate for any sort of political power or try to gain social status through politics and demand that the government do something to help them, but was more so an advocate of these same black Americans to do the work themselves. He was a big proponent of vocational um, work and made very little use of the liberal arts. And this was something that had, of the Reconstruction era, been an interesting philosophy. There were many a black person that had finally been freed from slavery and had these skills, and it is understandable that being raised in the South, that Booker T. Washington saw all of these different black people with their own abilities and said that this is a people who can do for themselves. They do not need to ask for anything and instead just need to work hard so that they can pull themselves out of the economic dire straits that they're in. Uh, he did uh, he did not at all advocate for an integration and wanted black people to assimilate, and was not what a modern person would call any sort of progressive, any sort of moderate, but was very conservative in his ideals and thinking. He had been prominent in the late 1800s, which is why when President Roosevelt had come into office in the early 1900s, he was invited to said White House to discuss these political ideas. An opposing voice at the time was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a northern born man, born in Massachusetts, to a freed family in a black town full of freed people. Du Bois was sympathetic to socialist ideas and Marxism. Du Bois had gone to college and had felt that black people should better themselves, not necessarily via economic means, but through education. And he did find value in the liberal arts and music and painting and all of such. He did say that black people need to gain power through education, and those who become educated then have the not only opportunity but the duty to pull up other black people so that the mass of black Americans can experience what prosperity in America could be. Uh, there is a notion that Du Bois brings up called the talented tenth. The talented tenth is a philosophy of what I just said, and I will read exactly what Du Bois writes in his essay, The Talented Tenth, which was actually published in a book uh, collected and orchestrated by Booker T. Washington. Du Bois writes, the Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. And so, in this talented 10th ideology, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington and Scott Joplin, they are all of this class, the talented 10th, who are elitist a is a way to think of his ideology. But these elites, these who are more privileged, more educated, more prominent, they have the duty to pull up the rest of their people. In this opera, Treemonisha actually deals with these ideologies. It seems that Joplin has some of both of their ideologies wrapped into this. Booker T. Washington was not a fan of trying to keep alive African traditions as blacks were in America. He was he was a believer Protestant, and so these African traditions that may have been religious, he rejected those vehemently. W.E.B. Du Bois was not a fan of religion altogether, but he did say, and he was a fan of continuing to venerate the ancestors before us and keeping these African traditions alive. The African traditions in Treemonisha would be the hoodoo practitioners. Again, hoodoo is a blend of multiple practices and beliefs coming from European folklore with magic and African traditions and Native American traditions. The Native American part of all of this is using herbs that are native to the land of America, these indigenous plants, and using them in a way to protect others or to heal others that's not in line with Western medicine and science. And in the story, these hoodoo practitioners are maligned and they are made to be villains. They are made to be seen as a moral decay. Um, and in Treemonisha, because Treemonisha is educated, because she has this status as they said she's the smartest in our race, the town people say in the opera, she now sees beyond what these hoodoo practitioners are pushing. She does not fall victim to what they have been saying and does not believe in what they profess, that these bags of luck would do anything for the townspeople, and that the townspeople are being superstitious, much to their own dismay. Um, this, especially with the evidence that she is born in the same town as Joplin, and even in the notes for the opera, she started her education this around the same time as when Joplin would have received his, when his mother was cleaning homes, his music education. It is reasonable to believe that Joplin is rejecting these old African traditions, these hoodoo practices, and saying that these are a moral stain on the black community, especially with him being in the South and where so many former slaves would have been working as sharecroppers on former plantations and whatnot. He would have come in contact with these in his early childhood before he left for the North. He, however, also does reject organized religion in the story. There is the character of Parson Altock. And Parson Altock, he comes through after Treemonisha war gets rid of the hoodoo practitioners. He comes by and all the townspeople gather around him and he basically gives a sermon. And it's interesting. Initially, when I watched this, uh, it seemed like this was a big, glaring exposure of how Joplin lacked as a librettist. But in looking at different documents and research papers about this opera, it seems like this actually may have been intentional. The sermon that is given by Parson Altock to the townspeople is extremely basic and has almost zero weight behind it. The words that he uses, it feels almost like what the reviewer said of the entire opera. It feels thin and unconvincing. In the opera, he is telling the people of the town what to do and what not to do. He says, "Do not tell lies and steal. Live like brothers and sisters. Don't harm your brothers, don't harm your sisters. Remember each day your debts you should pay." And the reasoning for all of this, because it's good advice. And that does not hold moral weight. It feels like when someone says, "Because I said so." There is no it truly does feel like a paper tiger. There's nothing behind these words, but the town is enamored with this, and the town is extremely wrapped up in what the pastor is speaking about. And when they do, you realize that Treemonisha is not among all of the townfolk. The townfolk, they are the chorus in this opera, and they are listening to him. And when the chorus is finished singing and when he leaves, you realize that Treemonisha has been kidnapped by the hoodoo practitioners. Now, I personally feel that this is Joplin's saying that these town folks, and they are probably a stand-in for the larger black community, are being blinded by men who give sermons and organize religion as a whole. These words that are given by these pastors aren't exactly meaningful and hold weight or merit. They seem to just be cheap words, and the pastor himself is named All Talk. There isn't exactly action behind this, and it very much feels like because they're wrapped up in this, that they are missing what's actually happening in their community. They're not actually taking action and doing anything to help Treemonisha, who gets kidnapped. She does get helped again by someone who she educated, which again, this is that talented 10th. If you are of status, if you are of means, then you should go back down and pull up the others with you so that all of you can progress. This feels very intentional and like what Joplin had been hearing from Du Bois. So the one who had been educated, Remus, he comes through and is able to outsmart the hoodoo practitioners who initially tie her up and want to throw her onto a beehive because they can no longer make money selling the hoodoo bags of luck. And when she returns to the town, Remus, he is a proponent of killing the head hoodoo practitioner, Zedric, and Treemonisha, who is the one directly educated by the white mother that employed Treemonisha's mother. Because she's had this direct education from the higher sources, she is giving the townfolk are of the mind that they can kill Zedric. But Treemonisha says, no, this is not right. This would be wrong. We would just be just like them. And it is interesting to see how Remus is educated, but not enough to have come to this conclusion by himself. This virtue that she has also is what makes the townspeople say, we need to make her in charge. And so there are interesting dueling ideologies where the townsfolk are not the townsfolk, again, they seem to be a stand-in for the larger black community, and it looks like Joplin is saying that these people who are either wrapped up by the church or the ones who are following the hoodoo practitioners are all wrong. They're all following a religion in one way or another and are not moral and are not upright and need to be more educated so that they can be upstanding, which is why they end up electing Treemonisha to lead them all, which they do at the end, again, as a stand-in for black progression. This is what the opera speaks about. And so it is very interesting to hear about this being what went into it at the time. And also being that Joplin had moved around up north, he had landed in New York City, had landed in Harlem, in fact, in the early 1900s. W.B. Du Bois lived in Harlem the same time that Joplin did, and it seems that the time that Du Bois had lived in Harlem was when Joplin started to create Treemonisha. And so, again, just very interesting how the political discussions of the day found their way into this opera. Joplin, again, did not get to see the opera itself and only published the piano reduction of the score. So, in the 70s, when they had done their own arrangements of it, it was very interesting to hear what Dr. Anderson had imagined this would sound like to Joplin. Something else, as I mentioned earlier, about the 70s was the political discourse of that time. Just less than a decade earlier, there was the, excuse me, the Moynihan Report had come out. Now, the Moynihan Report was a. Sorry, let me just pull this up. Thank you. So, the Moynihan Report is the shorthand for it. The report was initially called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which was a study done in the 60s by a white man, last name Moynihan, who had looked at what was going on in black communities and had said that the black community was in dire straits. The reason for this, however, he had said was things like fatherlessness and moral decay. That blacks in America were not prospering because they did not have the mental fortitude to keep themselves aright, educate themselves, pull themselves out of these situations that they're in. And there was a reckoning with this article. Many different conversation was had about it. Dr. King had even commented on the study, saying that he had found that there was merit to some of these findings, but he was afraid that these findings would then influence others to more stringently and harshly punish black people and use these as a method to increase the racial mistreatment of blacks in America. He had Others have said, and this is probably where King had lied, even though this wasn't mentioned a lot, that this that these observations that Moynihan had made were calling the symptoms the sickness. And instead of it being blacks in America have uh, different levels of education and don't have different families that are full families with a mother and a father, saying that this is the problem instead of it being that America has created conditions to disenfranchise black homes, to lock up the men who would be the breadwinners in those days, and the people who would be protesting would be arrested, or the young men would be arrested before they got a chance to go to college, or there was not funding for schools to give them an education that was adequate enough to admit them to college. All of these are more all of these are the systematic things that would create the conditions that Moynihan had observed. But Moynihan, again, it seemed like Moynihan was treating what he saw as the problem. He put the onus on the black family as opposed to the government and society that had made the black family what it was. The term blaming the victim actually was coined after this report, after someone had after someone had put this through scrutiny in the 70s, I believe the term was created. And so now in the 70s, we have the Moynihan Report coming out, and all of this is putting black families and uh, just black community in a negative light. Treemonisha comes around, and when it is staged in 72, uh, there is now this representation of the black family. Ned, who is Treemonisha's father, he sees Monisha, his wife, almost fall victim to the hoodoo practitioners, almost going towards them and buying their wares. And this is showing that he himself is a moral authority and he sees past their tricks and he has the final word, and this is what the black family is supposed to make. And also, the black family together makes an educated daughter. Um, all of this is in the air at the time, and it's probably what helps aid in the positive reception of this opera when it's put on, finally, more than 60 years after it was originally created, and almost 60 years after the death of Joplin. But yes, it was put on again in the 70s, first at the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, and then Houston Grand Opera premiered it in 1975. This arrangement, however, was of Gunther Schuller, who was a musician of the day, a composer, and had created this arrangement in what feels very grand. When I first listened to it, it felt honestly a bit musical theater-y, and I thought that that was just my own sensibilities. However, it seems that in the 2010s, I believe it was either the 2010s or the early 2000s, the early aughts, there was a composer and arranger named Rick. Let me try and get his name. I apologize. But Rick Benjamin, yes. Rick Benjamin and the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, I believe, or Ragtime Symphony, had created their own arrangement of this work. And in the CD for this, for their recording of it, there's actually 112-page book of the opera where Rick Benjamin has illustrations and speaks about his different findings, where the orchestration for the Schiller arrangement seems to be a bit big and again grand for what Joplin would have done. Joplin, again, he'd been a traveling musician and done productions where they had to get up and leave, and things had to be light and not have these huge amounts of people in the pit. And so it's reasonable to believe that, well, that there would be less instruments. I want to play a couple musical examples of what these different arrangements look and sound like. The earlier production of it in the 70s, Zadzedric is played by Oba Babatunde, who is a very accomplished film and stage actor. But his voice is not an operatic one, and it looks like they decided to let his voice be one that sticks out, as he has a more musical theater sound, a more classical stage sound, or American stage sound, I should say, as opposed to an operatic sound, as the rest of the singers do. But here, I want to share, yes, the 70s version of Treemonisha. One moment. Here it is. I want to sell to you this bag of nothing. Your enemies it will keep away. Over your front door you can hang it, and good luck will come each day. Will it drive away the blues and never-ending blues? It'll drive the blues, I'm thinking, and will stop Nick from booze drinking. No, that bag you's not going to buy, 'cause I know the price is high. I must tell you plain and bold, it is worth its weight in gold. This here bag will keep some love spring, and we need it here just this kind of thing. So yes, again, we see that the voice of Zedric, the villain who is trying to push his bag of luck, this is more musical theater sound, and the orchestra is pretty lush. Uh, Here I have the Rick Benjamin orchestration, and I want to show how there's a difference in the singing for this, and also listen to the sparseness of this arrangement. I will be actually speaking about that later in the next video that I play. So yeah, as we can hear, there is an operatic sound, and it is a little. There's less pieces in this. I want to play uh, right here's Ragtime Opera and Treemonisha and Appreciation, where he speaks about the differences in this orchestration.
So those of you who do know this work probably know it through this recording here. It's the Deutsche Grammophon recording from 1975, original cast recording. That is good. Unfortunately, we don't have the orchestration. It's been lost. So any version that you see or hear is going to be someone's reconstruction of the orchestration from the piano reduction. In this case, it's the one by Gunther Schuller, and it sounds pretty good. And that's the way things sat for a very long time until scholars like Rick Benjamin came along. And he wipes the slate clean. He says, you know what, as good as that one is, I think I can do better. He has a personal collection of some 10,000 musical scores from the era, and studying those, he says, I think I know how this might have really sounded like. And his contention is that the Houston Grand Opera performance, well, it's a little bit too grand. There are too many players in the pit, the chorus is too large. In reality, this was never going to work. Scott Joplin did not have the financial resources to have that many people moving around. The traveling shows of the time, based on, say, minstrel shows, tended to be light and fast and agile. They had to be able to set up and break down very quickly and move from city to city. There is no way that many musicians could have done this, and let alone have him pay for all of this. So what he does is he has an orchestral reduction. Now, the reduction is, I think, about 11 players plus the piano. 11 plus P was actually a thing back then. So in other words, there is one violin, no first violin section, one second violin, one cornet, one trombone, one piano, and so forth. Lest you think that 11 players plus a piano cannot generate a sufficient volume to fill a concert hall, I draw your attention to the orchestral reduction of Copland's Appalachian Spring for chamber orchestra. If you've ever heard that performed live, they have no problem generating volume. So when you hear this, it's a thinner sound, it's a more immediate, direct sound, it's a more in-your-face sound. And as much as I like the Houston Grand Opera production, I think I like this one better.
So yeah, as we see, there are a few differences in each arrangement of this, since everyone is approximating what they believe Joplin would be doing. Um, so yeah, there are many different things that we can dive into for this opera. There are political differences within the opera. There are these different musical things that everyone is approximating, because no one can get what Joplin specifically wanted, and no one is ever going to, because these scores have been destroyed. However, this is a valiant effort in Joplin in trying to create what is considered the first folk American opera, and all black opera written and created by all black actors and all black musicians, and composed by the man himself, Scott Joplin. Thank you very much for listening to this, and I hope that you take a listen to Treemonisha by Scott Joplin.